Hello and welcome back to The Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 116 called Clovis, King of the Franks. In the last episode we heard about the rapid Islamic conquest of Visigothic Spain. By the year AD 719 the Arab-Berber army had conquered Iberia and was invading Gaul, or what is modern France. They seemed unstoppable. Would Western Europe fall to Islam, and would the Qu'ran be taught in the schools of Oxford, as Edward Gibbon rather mischievously speculated? Of course, Gibbon knew the outcome. The Arab advance into France came to a shuddering halt at the Battle of Poitiers, or Tours as it's sometimes called, in 732, when Charles Martel, or Charles the Hammer, would inflict the first major defeat on the Arabs in Western Europe, just as the Byzantine Emperor Leo III did in the East in 717 to 718 at the Siege of Constantinople. Thereafter, the Arabs' hopes of adding Europe to their vast empire would be checked in the west by the Franks and in the east by the Byzantines. In episodes 111 to 113, we looked at the Byzantines, and in the next few episodes I want to look at their western counterpart, the Franks. It comes as no surprise to say the Franks were important in history, indeed crucial, for they not just halted the Arab invasion of Western Europe, but under their greatest king, Charlemagne, they created a vast empire encompassing modern France and much of Germany, Italy, Switzerland and the Low Countries, in other words, most of Western Europe. Some historians believe Charlemagne's empire, the Carolingian Empire, was the starting point for modern Europe, although it broke up fairly rapidly after his death. It would of course take the best part of 1,000 years for modern Europe to develop, but when Charlemagne was crowned as the new Roman emperor in AD 800 in Rome, in my opinion, the Franks rose above all the other Germanic invaders of the Roman Empire to become the true inheritors in Western Europe of the once mighty Roman Empire. So let's start at the beginning of the Franks' story. They're first mentioned in Roman sources as a major German tribe in the turbulent 3rd century AD. The Romans called them Franki, which was probably copied from the Germanic term they used to describe themselves, possibly meaning fierce, similar to the old German word for that term, Frankas. But the striking point about the Franks is how relatively unsuccessful they were in their early history, certainly compared with barbarian groups like the Goths and Vandals. While the Goths and Vandals created large kingdoms in Italy, Spain and North Africa, the Franks remained in a bit of a backwater in what is now northern France and the Low Countries. However, everything changed for them in the second half of the 5th century, and even more in the 6th. This time, at least up to 591, is wonderfully well recorded by Gregory of Tours, who wrote his famous History of the Franks in the 570s and 580s. Not only is Gregory's history one of the most engaging sources to emerge from the Dark Ages, but it also described events that were profoundly important, in particular the reign of the Frankish king Clovis, whose dates are 582 to 511. The founder of the Merovingian dynasty, who forged the first strong Frankish kingdom in what is now France. Before we get to Clovis, who's the principal subject of today's podcast, let's hear some more about his chronicler, Gregory, since he's such a fascinating character. Gregory was not a Frank, but a Gallo-Roman from an aristocratic family. He lamented the cultural dark age that had engulfed Gaul after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. Quote, "In fact, in the towns of Gaul, the writing of literature has declined to the point where it's virtually disappeared altogether." End quote. He confessed he felt obliged to write his history, quote, "to keep alive the memory of those dead and gone." But his style was not in the slightest pompous, nor imitating the classical authors of antiquity, just the opposite. He wrote in simple vernacular Latin, apologising for the simplicity of his writing when he said, quote, "My style is not very polished." But he was too modest. In fact, he wrote some of the best remembered sentences from late antiquity, including the wonderful and often quoted opening sentence of his history, quote, "A great many things keep happening, some of them good, some of them bad," end quote. Gregory wasn't just a chronicler. As the Bishop of Tours, he played a prominent role in the political and religious life of his age. This was what gave him such a unique insight into the characters of the Frankish kings and queens, many of whom he knew personally, although Clovis, his greatest subject, lived 6 decades before he began writing. Unlike some chroniclers, he never showed off about his own exploits or boasted of his connections, and most unusually for a committed Christian, he didn't write to show God's omnipotence in human affairs, as with so many of the bigoted, self-righteous clergy who wrote in the dark and medieval ages. Instead, he exhibited striking warmth and compassion for the people around him. For example, when plague struck Gaul in 580, as it did repeatedly in the 6th century after the first outbreak of the Justinianic plague in 541, he wrote, quote, "It attacked young children first of all, and to them it was fatal. And so we lost our little ones, who were so dear to us and sweet, whom we cherished in our bosoms and dandled in our arms, who we'd fed and nurtured with such loving care. As I write, I wipe away my tears," end quote. I can't imagine a more moving testimony to the human devastation caused by the indiscriminate slaughter of this disease that would in the Middle Ages be called the Black Death. And Gregory in no way blames the plague on the sinfulness of humanity, which is a repellent feature of the writings of other clergymen. His most important legacy was his detailed history, on which we depend for most of our knowledge of this turbulent age. But what makes it so special is the human emotions of the people he described. Nowhere is this shown better than with the relationship between the great Frankish king Clovis and his queen Clotilde, a Burgundian princess and devout Catholic, who, Gregory tells us, was determined to convert her pagan husband. For unlike the Goths and Vandals, the Franks were late converts to Christianity. But before we get to the story of Clovis and Clotilde, we should begin with some background about the world into which Clovis was born. As I mentioned, the Franks were not the most successful of the German tribes that invaded the Roman Empire in the 5th century AD. Far from it. Their weakness was political disunity. Several Frankish tribes inhabited the region of the Lower Rhine near the Roman frontier and were at war with each other as much as with the Romans. In the 4th century, they were recruited by the Romans as mercenaries and even made into Roman legionaries. They were clearly good soldiers, since several quickly rose up the ranks of the Roman army, so that towards the end of the 4th century AD, 3 Franks, Arbogast, Balto and Riceremes, had all achieved the lofty status of magister militum, which was the equivalent of a field marshal in the Western Roman army, and Riceremes was even made a consul. The Romans had a soft spot for the Franks and regarded them as the most civilized of the Germanic barbarians. The 4th century Roman poet and writer Claudian described the Salian Franks, from whom the high-ranking officers were recruited, as preferable to the Ruparian Franks occupying the Middle Rhine region, who he regarded as more barbaric. But any Frank was better than the Alemanni, who the Romans thought were the most savage of all the barbarians. The Franks seem to have shared this view, and on that fateful night in December AD 406, when the Germanic hordes crossed the frozen Rhine into Gaul, devastating the province before proceeding into Spain, they fought alongside the Romans against their German cousins. Cooperation between the Franks and Romans remained good as the Western Empire tottered towards collapse. In AD 451, contingents of Franks fought in the Great Battle of the Catalonian Fields against Attila the Hun. The Roman general Aetius had brought together a Romano-Germanic coalition in which the main military muscle undoubtedly lay with the Visigoths, whose military prowess was sufficient to turn the tide against the Huns. And that's where we can start our story, since the key question after Attila's defeat was who would rule Gaul as the Huns departed. Would it be the Romans, the Visigoths, or the Franks? This question became urgent when Aetius was brutally assassinated by the jealous and incompetent Western Roman Emperor Valentinian II in 454. Called the last of the Romans, Aetius proved to be exactly that for the Western Empire. After his death, the inhabitants of Gaul ceased to pay homage to the concept of a Roman state. Instead, there were four independent groupings, the most powerful of which was the Visigoths, who'd settled in Aquitaine along the southern Atlantic coast. Southeastern Gaul was dominated by the Kingdom of Burgundy. In central and northern Gaul, the last remnant of the Roman Empire north of the Alps survived as an isolated Roman state, called by historians the Kingdom of Soissons, since Soissons, 70 miles northwest of modern Paris, was its capital. Its ruler was Aegidius, one of Aetius's generals. Last, but far from least, was, of course, the land of the Franks. At the time of Aetius's death in 454, several Frankish tribes existed, still mainly fighting each other. Our only meaningful source on them is Gregory of Tours, who attributes the first moves towards consolidation among these tribes to a warlord called Merovech, who he describes as the first of the Merovingian dynasty. Gregory called Merovech and his successor Childeric the long-haired kings, or in Latin regnes criniti, since an important part of their royal appearance was long hair. Why this was so special has long baffled historians who've wondered if long hair may have harked back to pre-Roman days when all the Salian Franks wore their hair long, later restricting it to just their kings as a sign perhaps of some magical royal power. In short, we don't know why long hair was a prerequisite for a Merovingian king, but there's no doubt it was non-negotiable, since a haircut was reserved for a dethroning. A fascinating insight into the early Merovingians was provided in 1653 when Childeric's grave was discovered in Tournai in northern France. Its contents were like those of an Anglo-Saxon king in England uncovered in East Anglia at Sutton Hoo in 1939. They were a mix of Roman and barbarian objects, so typical of the confused culture of the Dark Ages. Amidst hundreds of Roman gold coins and classical Roman ornaments such as bracelets, buckles and goblets lay the barbarically severed head of Childeric's horse. Presumably the unfortunate horse was intended to enter the afterlife with his master. The most striking multicultural artefact was Childeric's signet ring, crudely wrought in gold depicting him with long hair, but with his name engraved in elegant Latin characters. Childeric was almost certainly illiterate, so he would have had little understanding of what the letters stood for. Finally, we get to Clovis, who was Childeric's son and little more than a boy at 15 years old in 481 when he succeeded his father. But in the next 30 years, he would establish the kingdom of the Franks as the dominant power in Gaul and lay the foundation, some historians would say, for the Carolingian Empire, modern France, and even modern Europe. His first test was against the Roman kingdom of Soissons, now ruled by Aegidius's son Syagrius. We have almost no records of what this last remnant of Roman power in Gaul was like, but I would cast from your mind any images of Roman legionaries wearing red cloaks. In 486, the year when Clovis met Syagrius in battle, I suspect the Romano-Gallic army that fought Clovis's Franks was similarly equipped with swords, spears, shields, but limited armour. At the battle, Clovis fought with two other Frankish kings, Ragnacar and Chaleric, and despite Chaleric's betrayal when he fled the battlefield, he won an important victory, defeating the Roman army and forcing Syagrius to flee south to the safety of the Visigoths. His occupation of this Roman state doubled the territory under his control, and he won over Frankish warriors who had previously supported Syagrius. Clovis's lands were further enlarged when he subsequently seized the treacherous Chaleric's lands and imprisoned him. The details of Clovis's life have become shrouded in legend, making it hard to distinguish fact from fiction. The main legend surrounds his conversion to Christianity, about which Gregory of Tours is eloquent, describing vividly the relationship between the pagan Clovis and his Christian wife Clotilde. He married Clotilde in around 493. She was a Burgundian princess and a passionate Catholic. According to Gregory, she was determined to convert her husband, but he wouldn't listen to her. She had 5 children with Clovis, and with the first, a son named Ingomer. She insisted he was baptized against her husband's wishes. Unfortunately, the child died soon after his baptism. Infant mortality was high at this time, but according to Gregory, Clovis was furious and blamed his wife's Christian belief for the child's death. But this didn't deter Clotilde, who was made a saint after her death, and she stubbornly stuck to her religion. According to Gregory, she told her husband his pagan beliefs were ridiculous. Quote, "The gods who you worship are no good. They haven't even been able to help themselves, let alone others." This was a brave thing to say when her husband was famous for splitting his opponent's heads in two with an axe. When Clotilde had their second child, she again insisted he should be baptized, again against Clovis's wishes. Tension between the two mounted when the child fell ill after his baptism, causing Clovis to rail against his wife. But fortunately, the child recovered, due, Clotilde told the king, to her prayers. Clotilde wouldn't give up her mission to convert her husband, and knowing that the thing he cared about most of all was victory on the battlefield, she told him that if he prayed to Christ, he would win his next battle. Gregory says that in 496 a strong force of Alemanni invaded the Frankish kingdom and initially defeated the Franks, until, according to Gregory, Clovis finally succumbed to his wife's demands. Quote, "He raised his eyes to heaven. 'Jesus Christ,' he appealed, 'you who Clotilde tells me is the Son of God, you who she says will give victory to those who trust in you, I beg for your help.'" End quote. Shortly afterwards, the Franks won a great victory over the Alemanni at the Battle of Tolbiac. Clovis admitted his wife had been right all along and converted to Catholicism. The bishop Remigius baptized him and 3,000 of his soldiers on the 25th of December 496 at Rheims. That at least is the legend. So what really happened, similar to Constantine's alleged conversion to Christianity on the night before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in AD 312, I suspect the truth is more complicated than Gregory was willing to let on. First, Clovis strikes me as an astute and ruthless politician. His skill lay in exploiting to his advantage the complex web of different peoples and political allegiances in post-Roman Gaul. His own Salian Franks were, of course, his main support base and formed his army. But it seems likely he wanted to gain the support of the Gallo-Roman community, of which Gregory of Tours, of course, was one, which probably outnumbered the Franks and comprised most of the inhabitants of Gaul. The Romano-Gallic Church was a powerful institution for these people, and I can't help feeling Clovis's marriage to Clotilde was more carefully planned than Gregory lets on. Gregory was writing at least 6 decades after Clovis died in AD 511, and so the legend of Clotilde's campaign to convert her husband had by that time become an integral part of church history which he couldn't contradict. However, I suggest a more realistic interpretation of Clovis's marriage and subsequent conversion is that he was already planning to convert before he married her. I think his aim all along was to win the support of the Gallo-Roman Church and community, although he had to be careful not to alienate his own warriors, who, like him, were pagans. Marriage to Clotilde offered 2 advantages. First, she was, it seems by her own choice, a committed Catholic, and she was also related to the Burgundian royal family. It's worth noting that her Nicene Catholicism was an anomaly among the Burgundians, who were mostly Arian Christians following the fashion of the Germanic invaders like the Goths, Vandals and Burgundians. This would have profound implications going forward. After Clovis's conversion, the Franks established themselves as the Catholic Church's most fervent supporters, integrating themselves firmly into Romano-Gallic society and facilitating a tie with the Catholic Church that went beyond Gaul. In short, without Clovis's conversion to Catholicism rather than Arianism, Charlemagne's coronation by the Pope as emperor in AD 800 wouldn't have been possible, and nor would most of the rest of European history. Obviously, Clovis had no idea his marriage with Clotilde would set such an important precedent that would echo down the centuries. Marriage to Clotilde also brought political opportunities. It was her Burgundian connections which gave him the opportunity to intervene in a Burgundian civil war in 501, in which the Frankish army helped Godegisel defeat his brother Gundobad in exchange for tribute. Henceforth, the Burgundians became, in effect, the vassals of the Franks. During his 30-year reign, from 481 to 511, Clovis relentlessly expanded the frontiers of the Frankish state and brutally suppressed internal opposition to him. We only know the highlights told to us by Gregory of Tours and the later Burgundian chronicler Fredegar. As mentioned, he swallowed up the last Roman state in Gaul in 486 and then defeated the Alemanni in 493, extending the Frankish border east across the Rhine. One of his greatest victories came in 507 when he defeated and killed the Visigothic king of Toulouse, Alaric II, at the Battle of Vouillers. Alaric II was the great-grandson of the more famous Alaric I, who'd sacked Rome in 410, and his death caused political chaos in the Visigothic kingdom as civil war erupted. The Visigoths already controlled most of Spain at this time, and their focus would shift away from Gaul towards their Hispanic possessions, much to the Franks' benefit. Victory over the Visigoths gave Clovis the authority to stamp out any opposition to him at home. which was almost certainly brewing among the pagan Frankish nobility who disapproved of his Christian conversion. In the years from 507 to his death in 511, he executed the minor Frankish kings such as Ragnacar, Rignamer, and Ricard, all of whom were related to him and still pagans. Gregory of Tours says, rather ironically, he used to lament how few relatives he had left, omitting to mention he'd killed them. Clovis was the Frankish equivalent of the Emperor Constantine. In 511, just months before his death, he convened the First Council of Orleans, which was a little like Constantine's Council of Nicaea in 325. The Frankish bishops acknowledged his leadership of the Frankish Church. At some point between 507 and 511, Clovis codified Frankish law in the so-called Salic law. By the time of his death in 511, a united and powerful Frankish kingdom stretched from the Rhine to the Pyrenees, comprising some of Western Germany and most of modern France, except for the south, which remained in Visigothic hands. A great new power was emerging in Western Europe, which would change the course of history. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. We'll continue with the story of the rise of the Franks and the great Battle of Poitiers they fought with the Arabs in 2 weeks' time on the 16th of August. And if you like the podcast, why not leave a review, tell a friend, or best of all, sign up to my newsletter where you can get a free ebook. Just visit my website, nickholmesauthor.com. Link in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.